Okay, since it's about 1 o'clock, we'll go ahead and get started and we'll just hope a few people jump on. Hi, everyone. My name is Alicia. I'm the Southeast Florida Clean Cities Coalition Coordinator, and I just wanted to thank you all for joining us on our first ever hydrogen fuel webinar. So today we'll be discussing. One second, let me just give you a brief overview. Clean Cities Coalition is housed in the South Florida Regional Planning Council. We were designated in 1994 by DOB. We work on helping various stakeholders as far as with funding, events. If you guys need anything or have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. And I'm going to go ahead and introduce our guest speaker today, Remy. He's dedicated his career to bringing clean technologies into the mainstream, working with policymakers, businesses, and philanthropists to overcome market barriers. He recently relocated to Miami from California, where he was involved over many years in the development of the hydrogen infrastructure network, as well as a range of state policies for zero-emission vehicles. Remy serves on the board of Energy Independence Now, a California nonprofit that has singularly focused on advocacy and close government engagement in support of clean transportation for over 20 years. And now I'll go ahead and pass it over to Remy to go ahead and begin. Thank you, Remy.
Thanks so much, Alicia, and looking forward to hopefully what will be more of a conversation than just a presentation. Just by context, a little context on this, Alicia and I were talking several weeks back about some of the things going on in the South Florida community, because as she mentioned, I relocated back in September from California, and I was talking about the hydrogen experience that I'd had there, and we decided it'd be a nice topic to share with the group of Clean Cities participants. Having said that, I don't know what the level of interest or knowledge is, so what I was hoping to do is spend a little time just giving you a broad brushstrokes of what's happening in hydrogen and transport, and many of you, I'm sure, will know more details than what I'm going to go into about specific parts of that. But just so we're all kind of on the same page, and then mostly share kind of my experiences and perspectives on what's happened in the California context over the last 10 to 15 years, really, in terms of kickstarting things there. So a big caveat is I don't know really very much at all about the development of hydrogen-related activities, projects, even policies in the Florida context yet. So maybe if the opportunity comes up, we can hear from you guys about things that are happening. That'd be really interesting to me. And again, I'll go through some slides and share some information, but then I'm really looking forward to the discussion, any questions and perspectives we can all bring to the table. So Alicia, if you want to get us off to that first slide. So this is a picture of a hydrogen station in, I believe it's Studio City outside of LA, and it just opened up a couple of weeks ago, maybe 2 weeks ago. And the point is, if you look at it, you can see that this is real, it's happening, and it includes a lot of new looking technology, but also a lot of familiar things. You see Chevron involved, Toyota, it's a Toyota Mirai, a second generation fuel cell vehicle is parked there. And this is a sort of state-of-the-art station that's that has 3 simultaneous nozzles, so 3 cars can be refueling at the same time. It's quite a large station in relation to the first ones that went in. In California, it's 800 kilograms a day. Each car takes about 5 kilograms of hydrogen as you in compressed form. So it can give you an idea of how many can be refueled. It's built by a startup, First Element, which has been building a lot of the stations quite successfully in California, since many of the original fuel providers weren't clearly interested in being part of that business. And it's also giving 100% renewable hydrogen. I don't know the details of the station exactly, but based on the other First Element ones, it'd probably be taking hydrogen out of biomethane, and either physically bringing in biomethane or buying the equivalent credits like you would in the electricity market. So it's slated as 100% renewable, which meets some of California's standards. And the car itself, the Mirai, again, it takes about 5 kilograms of hydrogen. It can go, I think its range is close to 400 miles, so like a regular car. You can pump it up and fill it up in 3 minutes. So it's very much like a car experience. So you look at this and you imagine this is kind of what I'm used to. It's just that the nozzle's slightly different and the car is an electric car. So it's not some futuristic kind of thing, right? It really is real. And you'd see a lot of these around California, but you also see a lot of them in Japan and Germany and in Korea and South Korea also. Next slide, please. So just here's some other models of hydrogen vehicles that are out there. You'll see they're mostly sedans, some larger trucks, and some SUVs coming into the mix. And again, I don't know if you can see the names of them, but it's Toyota, Hyundai, Honda. Those have been the 3 leading Japanese makers, very involved for a while. And then a couple of the German companies. Daimler has been on and off for many years and quite deeply involved. And GM has a long history with a hydrogen fuel cell program. So the automakers are involved, and really they have been the ones at the front of the technology, really developing these vehicles and I'd say leading the charge to develop this whole market. The fuel cell the fuel providers themselves, which can be either companies like Air Products or Air Liquide who already serve hydrogen to other types of customers. They've gotten involved too, and as you saw before, the Chevrons and the Shells who have an interest in the long-term hydrogen market also been involved. But it's really the car manufacturers who've been at the table with the California state agencies kind of leading the charge. And in the same way, in slightly different, but in Germany and Japan, the car makers are involved, but those have been very heavily state-run programs where some of their local fuel providers have also been a big part of the conversation. So all of these car companies, as you'll see, are doing fuel cell vehicles, but they're also doing battery electric vehicles. And I think it's an important thing I'll come back to in a second, that the car companies see these as 2 complementary technologies that they want to be invested in on both sides of it. If you could go to the next slide. So, of course, it's not just small cars or even medium-sized cars. There's been a lot of fuel cell development and hydrogen for buses over many years throughout the world. And in the last year or two, you probably have heard quite a few mentions in the press around the heavy duty sector, the Class 8 trucks. There have been some startups, Nikola, with a range of difficulties, and Tesla's been talking about getting involved. But here, this truck is a Toyota partnership, and I think this one's in the port of LA, and they're looking at having 20 or so of these running around by the end of this year. I think that's the latest I knew about. There's also been hydrogen in some of the other port-related trucking and triage activities. Forklifts in many warehouses have been using hydrogen for many, many years, and the Airbus example there is aviation is looking to it. So hydrogen has a role to play in other forms of transport. It's not my area of expertise, but in many ways it might be an area that takes off faster, especially for the heavy-duty Class 8 trucks than we've seen in light duty. So it's definitely something to keep an eye on. The port discussion is also really interesting, and I'll refer to that a little bit later. Next slide, Alicia, please. So I just want to sort of address a conversation that often comes up when people mention hydrogen fuel cells vehicles and battery electric vehicles. And in the press, and it's very common to kind of think of these as sort of a race. Which one is going to be the first one out of the gate, and which one are we going to have? And if you bear with me, I think that there's a lot of things that point to that not at all being the case. The car companies don't believe it. Most of them, even though they've put a lot of energy in one area, they've always got a program on the other one too, whichever side of the fence they've been on. A lot of the regulators also believe that we're going to need both, and partly because they're so complementary. The first thing is that they're both electric vehicles, and so there's this common list of benefits that they both provide. The zero tailpipe emissions. So yes, there might be emissions in making electricity upstream or making hydrogen upstream, but it's very, very relevant that there's no emissions where the cars are being driven, especially for polluted cities. I mean, it started off in LA as our problem, but if you think of all the cities in Asia and elsewhere where local particulate emissions is such a huge issue, they'll take either of these. CO2 reduction potential, obviously that's one of the big goals of this transition, decarbonizing transport in general. And again, like on electricity, you can have electricity made from coal, not so good, or you can transition it slowly to renewables. Same on the hydrogen side. You can make hydrogen from fossil fuels with some reductions, or you can make them from renewable feedstocks. And again, the idea is that the potential in both cases is to go to zero emissions completely from the very, very source of making the fuel, even if you don't start there. So that potential is definitely there. And the fact that you can make electricity from in multiple ways is the same on the hydrogen side. One of the things about hydrogen is that you can make it from different renewable gas sources, waste gases. You can make it from through electrolysis from multiple electricity sources, and so every country can have these EVs. You don't have to be. It's not like petroleum where you're just hoping you've got one of these sources. So these technologies potentially can be zero emission, reduce carbon, be produced pretty much everywhere in the world in some way or another. And they share a vast amount of technology. It's basically an electric vehicle, and it's just a question of, are you storing the electricity in a battery, or are you making the electricity on board with a fuel cell as you need it? The rest of the vehicle, with some design modifications, is basically the same. So from the car company's perspective, it's the transition from an internal combustion engine to an electric vehicle is a huge one. But once you're there, it's a relatively a smaller step to make. So I will, if you can move to the next slide, Alicia. There are obviously complementary, they're complementary because they do have different strengths. So on the left side, the battery electric vehicles have strengths, as we know, with lighter payloads, especially like individuals, people, on the one hand, because the battery itself is so heavy, it's a heavy form of energy storage. Typically, the battery electric vehicles were initially thought of as really only good for small vehicles, smaller ranges. Now, with all the advances in battery technology, I would say that market has grown, and we're excited to see battery electric potential even in some heavy duty applications and SUVs and pickup trucks and things like that. But if you compare that on the fuel cell side, where the hydrogen itself is so light that you can really store a lot of energy on board. When you think about a Class 8 truck wanting to drive for hundreds and hundreds of miles, if that is a battery technology, you're going to either be carting that weight around. At a certain point, that's inefficient, or you're going to be looking at some significant refueling time, and time is money for sure for that business. So the fast fueling, the adaptation to heavy payloads has always made people think that would be the natural kind of market for hydrogen to slot into also. But on the infrastructure side, which is a key part of this, again, going back to the battery electrics, we've got existing electricity everywhere, right? You can go and buy an electric car, and you come home, you can plug it in. There's plugs everywhere in garages. We need to upgrade it if we're going to have a lot of them, and if we want them to charge fast. But electricity is everywhere. Hydrogen is barely anywhere at all. So on the hydrogen side, there's a big hump to get over to make infrastructure available on the one hand, and then the question of cost comes in right away. People say, well, the battery electric, even if you put a level 2 charger or something, maybe you're spending $1,000 or $2,000. It's not for an individual. It's not a huge incremental cost of car ownership. On the other hand, a station costs are coming down very, very fast because they've been these early generations of stations until now. But let's just say you're going to spend $1 million on a station. On the other hand, that $1 million station is going to support 1,000 vehicles in your neighborhood, right? So there's an overlap, and there's definitely a lot of analysis that goes into how that works. McKinsey did a study already many years ago saying that there's the economies of scale for infrastructure on the hydrogen side are such that at a certain point per vehicle, it definitely becomes cheaper to do that. And it looks more like our current gasoline distribution network. It's just good to remember that these two things really are different pros and cons, different challenges for the two segments. But ultimately, the way I see it, I live in a condo. I don't have a dedicated spot. And probably, if I given the option, would buy a fuel cell vehicle and fill it up at the pump down the road. If you have a garage and you're in the suburbs, you probably choose an electric if our ranges are similar. So there's very much a complementarity, and so I think it's always important to just kind of reassert that that's how most regulators see it. That's how most of the automakers see it. That these different technologies will find their different niches, and the bigger goal is to electrify everything. So just a little plug there for maybe not getting drawn into which one is better conversation too much. Alicia, if you can just go to the next slide, just a little bit broader context. So hydrogen consumption in the world at the moment is primarily the two on the left. It's part of petroleum refining and ammonia production for fertilizer. And so transport, you'll see, is still a small segment, but with the idea that will be growing. It means that that's where hydrogen is primarily available in areas where there's a lot of refining. There's even pipelines underground, like there are for natural gas, where you can just draw hydrogen right out of the ground, and very, very, very low cost. In other places, it's going to be more difficult. So if you could go to the next slide. So that's kind of leads to the question is where we get this hydrogen from, right? How are we going to make the hydrogen? Because although it's in every element, it's not naturally available to just tap into. So there are basically two common ways of making hydrogen. We'll start on the left. Electrolysis with an electrolyzer takes electricity from the grid and splits water. You probably did it in high school. It splits water into hydrogen and oxygen. And so you can capture that. And again, that's back to that previous comment. If your grid is already very clean, then that hydrogen is already very clean. If you're making electricity from coal, obviously it's got less profile. It's always better than gasoline on a well-to-wheels ratio profile overall. But the improvement is not as significant. The next line down, green hydrogen. Is if you do the same exact process, but you're using renewable power or nuclear power, then you would have no carbon well-to-wheels. So you'd literally be driving around with no CO2 emissions at all. And then from natural gas or coal, the sort of the fossil-based hydrogens, the most common right now is really the steam methane reforming, where you're taking the hydrogen out of the methane. So some people call that gray hydrogen. There's other ways. If you then capture the CO2 that comes out of that normally, if you put it in some kind of storage, you could call it blue hydrogen. There's basically a color for every kind of hydrogen. Of course, the hydrogen itself is always the same. It's just hydrogen. It's like saying green electricity or black electricity. You'll see turquoise hydrogen, yellow hydrogen, pink hydrogen. Have no fear. It's all the same. But it does give you, the sense of the opportunity here, and not only in terms of our ability to make it from so many different possibilities and feedstocks, but also the business opportunities here. Everybody who's in this sector already and can see an opportunity to make this new fuel. So that's just kind of a bit of a background on sort of the light duty sector and a little bit where the hydrogen is going to have to come from, and I think a lot of people aren't aware of that, and so forgive me if it's repeating things that many of you already know. Alicia, I wanted to say that I was going to switch into the California conversation. We can take some questions about in general now or all together. What did you prefer, one or the other?
If you want, you could start off with California, and then when you're done, I can, if anyone wants to go ahead and unmute themselves, if you have any questions, we can go ahead and start that.
Okay, sure, that sounds good. So yeah, like I mentioned at the beginning, I spent many years working in California on the development of the initial network, and I played kind of a bridging role as a fuel cell partnership that produces actually this map, and I was very involved in that partnership, and it brings automakers, the state agencies, and the fuel providers together to try and coordinate everything. So I've kind of seen it from a variety of angles. Just wanted to share kind of how we got there, because it wasn't as easy as it might look now. So on the roads right now in California, I think they've hit about 10,000 fuel cell electric vehicles. A lot of them are Toyotas and the Toyota Mirai and the Honda Clarity, and with increasing number, I believe, of the Hyundais. And it's quite fun. You're driving around the Bay Area, you'll find yourself behind a fuel cell vehicle, and sometimes it's very prominent, it's a futuristic looking thing. Sometimes it's just a little tag like the hybrids were, or still are sometimes. So it's definitely happening. You see the stations. There's 45 open stations, or maybe 46 with the last one. I'm not sure the exact count, but that masks that there's several dozen in the pipeline permitting right now and being built. I think they're looking at reaching 70 plus within a year or so, and the goal is to reach sort of a magical number of 100, where the state has been very involved in trying to get to that 100. The getting to that point though was tricky. Alicia, if you can move to the next slide. And part of it is there's this sort of geographical balancing act that you have to make. If you think about being from the perspective of an automaker, you want to sell a car. Obviously, there has to be some stations around. Nobody's going to buy the car if there aren't. And you can't just have one station if you're going to sell 100 cars. You have to have a certain number of minimum stations in sort of a core area. And so right from the beginning, they decided LA and then later on the Bay Area would be the sort of the core regions that would start building out a density of stations. And those stations would have to be quite big in the terms of how many fuel cell cars they can service per day. And that's fine, but if you're going to sell a car, you probably want the person to be able to take it to Lake Tahoe or to be able to drive between the two regions. Otherwise, they're going to feel like it's very limited. And so we have some connector station. Right now, there's just one on I-5 halfway between the two in Coalinga, and that was a kind of a critical thing. And then a couple of the destinations, like Lake Tahoe, were also of a different profile. So there was this geographical balance of, do we put tons of our effort in one area and only limit sales in that area, or how quickly can we go kind of statewide with this? And then next slide, please, Alicia. At the same time, there's a big timing question. The same timing as that I just mentioned. Obviously, when you sell a car, you have to have the stations. But if you think about it now from the station provider, who wants to be the one who spends several $1 million, puts a station up, and now waits 5 years for a couple of vehicles to show up? So, and there's the lead time in the development of the vehicles. There's the lead time of the permitting. So there's a very, very delicate balance around getting that timing, getting those numbers to climb, both regionally and in total numbers, so that it makes sense to both sides of the equation. They can sell the cars, and the fuel providers have a business case. And so the state had to get quite heavily involved in both of those aspects. There was these kind of scoring systems developed, very intricate scoring systems to kind of determine, is this the right station and the right location and the right timing that we as the state would like to support to get over this kind of natural chicken and egg kind of problem, right? Because they realize that we're going to have to support the stations. No one's going to voluntarily support and build that station until there's some cars on the market. But which station, how big, where's the best place? All those kind of questions were very, very hard to work out. And there's a lot of work went with the universities as well into kind of saying, well, we would like to be able to optimize this so that everybody can get to a station within 6 minutes, let's say. And so quite quickly they saw through the LA basin that you could actually do that with some strategically located stations, and it was worthwhile for the state to put money into those ones to at least provide that coverage. If not, right away, sort of the depth is, now that we go from 100 cars to 1,000 cars, how's that going to look? So that was a very complex thing, and the grants in particular had to be fine-tuned towards making it make sense for the businesses to do that. So that was kind of a delicate balance. You can go to the next slide. There was, in the California context, there was a lot of context that was pushing in this direction too. And so these might be things that you're already very well aware of, but I'll just go through them real quick. ZEV, the zero emission vehicle mandate, was mandating that automakers sell a certain proportion of their cars, that a certain proportion be electric vehicles, and if they weren't, they would have to buy credits from those who were overproducing. So the car companies were kind of being pushed. The low carbon fuel standard was telling fuel providers, look, the overall average carbon of what you sell, we don't care what it is, but whatever it is that you sell for the transport, it's going to have to go down. And if you're going to carry on selling fuel, petroleum, you're also going to have to start doing something else. Originally, they thought mostly biofuel, but then electricity and hydrogen became part of it. And so the fuel companies were being pushed to do something, or at least in the same way that a company like Tesla was able to make money off of selling credits to car companies who decided not to do electric. There was an opportunity to make money by generating your low carbon fuel standard credits if you were selling hydrogen, and selling them to, say, an oil company that decided not to get in that business. So there's both a push and an incentive mechanism, financial incentive mechanism, to at least reduce the loss. I mean, I don't think a lot of people thought that was in itself a business case, but it was reduce the loss during those early years. And the California Resources Board, the EPA, was overseeing this program in addition to a lot of other mandates for renewable fuel content and things like that. So there's sort of this regulatory push at the whole state level. Some state funding. The Energy Commission set aside funds for all sorts of alternative fuels, but there was definitely a carve out for hydrogen, and they were the ones sort of administering these grants and that process that I was talking about before. Sort of which station, how big, how much should we give them? Some of the work that I was involved in was, should we give them operating funds as just that are linked to when the cars aren't there? So if the cars come, we're not going to subsidize them. They're supposed to make money. But if the cars didn't come, it's not really their fault. So let's help them out. And same with the fuels, the LCFS. If they can sell fuel, they can get that credit. But if they weren't selling fuel because there was no cars, we kind of built in some credit for just having put up the capacity. So anyway, so there's regulations, there's money, and a lot of regional involvement. And this was critical because, it's one thing to kind of set the overall framework. It's quite another thing to deal with the permitting. Nobody's ever built one in your neighborhood. The cities and the counties had all these different, questions about what to require, safety protocols, all sorts of things. There was kind of, a lot of growing pains and learning that had to go around it. Also workforce development questions, who is going to be able to manage this new infrastructure or later on service these vehicles. So education programs in the community colleges, automotive programs. There's a whole bunch of things that, when you build out a new industry that need to be thought of. So, and the regions, the counties, and the air districts were very involved in kind of working with the state and with the different participants through on those other topics. And then the automakers, a lot of automaker leadership here, even though they were originally pushed into it, there was a few who were leading the charge and really making sure that everything lined up, because they were going to have to sell a car. And if the station wasn't there, or if the nozzle was wrong, or if it wasn't a good user experience, all of those were problems for them. So they were very involved in kind of the overall consumer, kind of taking on the consumer perspective. So it doesn't just happen by itself, is, I guess, my point. And maybe you can go to the next slide, Alicia. Just sort of taking it up a notch there. This coordination and cost sharing is really essential in the early infrastructure. It might come a time when fuel companies, see the business as essential and will take that investment on their own. But at the moment, it seems like that low initial usage, that, I mean, they're relatively expensive stations, and then that whole coordination thing it's very hard to kind of just leave it be and hope that it works out. Some interesting things that were used in California, and I think this might be a question for other states, including Florida, is if you can concentrate demand, you can make that business case better. So transit centers, that can fuel buses, can also double duty as a station for some initial fuel cell vehicles. The port of LA is, one of the largest ports in the world, and the emissions from the port are one of the key problems for the entire LA basin. So they've been focused for a long time on going zero, dealing with zero emissions, and they have, hundreds of Class 8 and other heavy-duty vehicles that transport all those containers throughout the region and out of the port. So they've been very involved, and the beauty of that is that a lot of them are on these circular routes. There's a very concentrated demand. With one big pump, you can actually service a lot of large trucks and get a lot of volume through, and so the economics of that can be a good starting point. So places like ports or big distribution centers where they might all want to switch to hydrogen-powered forklifts because maybe the batteries they've got too much downtime as they're recharging. So you can leverage some of these demand spots. It's a way to kind of bypass a little bit that coordination challenge if you're going straight for the consumer market. And then supply side opportunities. Again, if you have to live in a place where there's a lot of refining going on, you've got a real head start. There's a lot of cheap hydrogen already in pipelines or ready for distribution, or if you can piggyback on some of the other ammonia production, or if you have a lot of sources of renewable natural gas. And all of these sort of supply side possibilities are things to think about too. And just kind of wanted to flag those there. So, I mean, just thinking back over the overall experience, I think we're not out of the woods yet in the California context, but it definitely feels like we're over the first really difficult hump, the chicken and egg part, consumer acceptance, and getting some of the key players involved. I think, if we look back on this 20 years from now, I have no idea whether we'll see that was the beginning of the huge part of the light duty sector or a more niche part of it, but hopefully it'll be prove out the technology that can also be applied to the rest of transport. I just wanted to kind of pull back from that just for a bit in terms of the overall hydrogen context, because a lot of times when you hear and read about hydrogen, everybody has a different interest in the things that it can do. It's such a versatile energy carrier, and energy storage means that everyone has an idea of where it could best be used. If you go to the next slide, Alicia, I just pulled out one of many slides here that show there's many roles in the overall energy transition to a low carbon energy system. And this is, I guess, 7 roles picked out here by McKinsey. Of course, we're just talking about decarbonizing transport. There's many different roles it can play within the electricity system and in bridging in bridging the transition in the gas network too. You can pump green hydrogen into a gas network and thereby lower the overall carbon intensity of that gas. If you can go to the next slide, there's 2 things that a lot of people talk about. One is sort of an alternative battery. If you're looking at a grid that wants to, be more and more renewables dependent, but they have a big seasonal difference. Maybe it's maybe the winter's very long and there's no sun, or the windy season is only part of the year. And so you've got this long-term storage. You can imagine if you want to build that out with batteries, there's some diminishing returns there for sure as you scale it. Hydrogen has the advantage that it's more easily storable. And so you basically couple an electrolyzer, so all that surplus energy that you're making, you turn it into hydrogen, store it on the top there, you can see, and then when it comes time to use that, you can use your fuel cell and recreate electricity as needed. So there's that kind of concept. I think the economics will only ever play out in certain segments, but it's definitely one thing people are thinking about. And then because it's storable, actually both in compressed gas form, which is the majority of what we're seeing in the light duty sector at the moment, but you can also liquefy it at very cold temperatures. Other countries, for example, I know Chile's been talking about, I've had a lot of conversations with people in Hawaii, like how could we take advantage of our ability to create excess renewable energy, which otherwise we couldn't export. How can we export electricity, basically? And so again, the economics we'll see. Maybe there's some applications in certain areas where they can ship hydrogen around, liquefy, just like they do petroleum right now. So hydrogen, again, multiple, very, very, very versatile fuel. We'll see which niches it ends up finding, but I'm very, very optimistic that we'll see it play a significant role in the grid, ultimately, and definitely in certain regions, and in the transportation sector, if not universally. So I hope that kind of gave a little bit of the lay of the land, and tried to come in under the 40 minutes that Alicia had asked, and leave plenty of time for conversation, questions, and please, I'm sure many of you have specific experience or something to contribute that the rest of the group would like. So let's think of this just as a kickoff to the conversation.
No, what I was going to say is if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask now. Go ahead and turn on your cameras, your microphones, and please feel free. Wendy, I was going to say, I see you turned on your camera first if you want to go ahead and ask a question. Or I'm sorry, Susanna first. I'm sorry.
Okay. Thank you for the presentation. I'm fairly unknowledgeable about hydrogen. I hope you didn't have culture shock when you came here from California. We're pretty far behind you in some respects.
I previously lived here and was very excited to come back. So I'm excited to see all the stuff that is happening. But yeah.
So my question is, because I just don't know, can hydrogen fuel cell stations, like I guess I would say more like the dispensing units, can they be co-located with for electric vehicle dispensing units? Can they be co-located on the same property, or are there safety issues or something with doing that? Is there a reason why it could not be?
That's a good question. I don't know of anything specific that prevents it. I don't think from a safety perspective. Hydrogen has the advantage that it's very light. So whether it's an accident, people say, oh, it's going to explode like a big ball of flame, but actually it's less dangerous than gasoline, which sticks around on the ground. It just evaporates. So or goes up, and so I think I don't see that there would be an issue there, but I definitely am not an expert in that area at all. In some cases, it's been so for example, between LA and San Francisco, there's a natural sort of middle ground. There's a bunch of charging stations in that town, and there's a bunch of, or the hydrogen connector is there too. A lot of times they're more likely to be co-located with gasoline stations because it's more that kind of experience. I'm in and out of there, I'm at the pump, and I'm on my way, versus the charging experience where maybe you want to be near some cafes or a shopping mall, or really want to let it charge while you do other things. And in fact, here we want the cars to get out of there as fast as possible to open it up for the next one. So again, I don't think there's a reason not to, but I think a lot of times they've naturally kind of found different niches. I hope that gives some an idea of how to think about it too.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Susanna.
Hi, Remy.
Hi.
Do these stations have the same infrastructure requirements as the traditional gas stations? Like the underground and that type of storage?
Right. So there is typically storage associated with it. Most of them that I know of are not underground. I think there's quite a lot of restrictions around that, but also a lot of them from the servicing perspective. The hydrogen is either made on site, so you can either make it on site or in a centralized truck. It kind of like gasoline is, but either in compressed tanks or in liquid form. And so different stations, depending on their size and how much utilization they get, are finding what's the best way to do it. So some of them bring in basically ready-made tanks full of compressed hydrogen and switch them out. And so there you need access to. So to your question, I think the infrastructure is actually a little bit different. Sometimes the storage will be behind the station and will be brought into the dispenser, but it's not sitting underneath there. I said that's kind of there's going to be, I think, a lot of innovation, especially once we get to scale and electrolysis comes down to the point where it's really cost effective to make the hydrogen on site. That's going to sort of maybe come up with, then we might see very different types of stations, maybe not just the typical gasoline model, and maybe, like you see charging now on rooftops. There's, if you could combine that with an electrolyzer and create some fueling opportunities there. But there's been a lot of work on the permitting, the codes around station infrastructure, and I'm hoping that it's translatable across the U.S. That wasn't too California specific. I mean, they had additional things like earthquake and those kind of things, but I'm sure we have our own issues to deal with in here too. So.
Well said. Thank you, Mark.
Sure.
Sorry about this. And then, Mr. Hamilton, did you have a question?
Yes, thank you. I actually have kind of two lines of questioning, which perhaps you could just speak to. Mm-hmm. The big risk from nuclear energy is the fact that we use pressurized water reactors. This hydrogen is very light, but in order to get enough energy, we have to pressurize it. So if we scale it up to a large extent, that's going to present some safety risks. So can you educate me a little bit on the level of pressurization and the risk that poses?
Sure, yeah.
Line is really along the economic scale. What kind of mileage can you get? And given the production capacity or mechanisms today, roughly what does that turn into in terms of cents per mile, so we could compare it against electricity and against gasoline?
Okay, great. Yeah, good questions. In terms of so the industry took a little while to kind of come to agreement on the level of pressurization that the cars would use. And there you have, on the one hand, what the car companies are worried about is space. So you can use hydrogen at very low pressure. That's not. It's more of a question of optimizing the storage. So they want it as compressed as possible, so they can put it under the back seat and still have a cargo space and all that. And so, whereas initially maybe the buses and others, where they weren't so worried, they could use the whole roof, and they weren't so worried about the pressure, they went for a lower pressure. We've ended up with an arm which is basically 10,000 psi. So it's very high pressure in these tanks, and that gives you great range without much volume. The downside, of course, of having very high pressure, like you said, first of all, the materials have to be quite sophisticated to maintain that pressure. It also uses energy to pressurize a vehicle like that. So for a while, there was to have one pump would be 700 over 30, or 35. Sorry, I'm getting my numbers mixed up. But it was double, and I think that kind of speaks to the versatility. If you're storing a lot of hydrogen and you have plenty of space, no point in compressing it, because it brings in other security and as well as materials kind of concerns. So I think that's going to be a trade-off. We'll see. Maybe trains and planes might come up with a different solution than even Class 8 trucks. But at the moment, it's quite high pressure. In terms of the costs, so right now, I think the the retail price of hydrogen, and it's sold per kilogram. So there's some education that's or some learning that's gonna happen for sure around what that means. So it's about, I think, between $10 and $13 per kilogram. And a kilogram, it has the energy content of a gasoline gallon, but it goes, because the car is so much more efficient, it goes about 2.5 times plus minus as far. So it ends up being basically the same price at the moment on a dollar per mile basis as gasoline. So that's what is happening right now in California. However, that's $13 hydrogen. I think in the pipelines under LA, they can pull it out and get it for literally cents per kilogram or less. So there's going to be a wide range of prices, and I think the benchmark will always be, let's beat gasoline. Of course, if you're a battery electric vehicle owner, you know that now you're used to paying a lot less than that. So I think there's going to be a lot of downward pressure to get that number down. But it is a combination of factors, more like going back to where is it being made, how far is it being trucked in on, or later, once these technologies are in mass production, can we just make it on the spot, which will bring down the cost tremendously. Because that $13 includes trucks coming in every few days, switching out tanks. There's a lot of time and expense just bringing it in that hopefully will go away with time. Hope that gives a little bit of a flavor of how to think about it.
And then actually, Remy, I have a question in regards to, I guess, like the fleet side of it. Have you heard or any of the vendors experience issues in maintaining like parts or servicing the hydrogen fuel like vehicles?
Yeah, good question. I haven't heard much talk about that. They've kept it pretty close to the chest. It's and the initial cars were actually entirely leased. And so any issues whatsoever was just brought back. I'm assuming for quite a while it's going to be, via the dealerships and some specialized shops until it becomes even, familiar to other mechanics. And again, that goes back to that question of the workforce development. I think, with these sophisticated vehicles and the electrics too, you can't just kind of show up anywhere and have a standard oil change equivalent. It's very specialized, computer-driven diagnosis, etc. Of course, the biggest advantage is that there's much, much less maintenance like there are in battery electrics. So there will be issues, of course, but there'll probably be fewer issues that are more complex rather than many average issues. And you can still change the tires anywhere you want and things like that. That's just like a normal car.
Okay. Very good. Well, one other question that I had, was there a lot of challenges in California for sourcing the hydrogen? For like the filling stations or anything?
Yeah. I think there was, so there were some companies like Air Products, for example, that already had an established business trucking and delivering compressed hydrogen. They had distribution centers that used it for the forklift trucks. They'd already made agreements with some transit centers who were using it for their buses. And so there was this sort of established routes, but and then some other companies like Air Liquide and others who were in the market were already bringing it in liquid form. So there's a few established players, but to be honest, they were just sort of waiting on the sidelines to see if this is a big enough market for me to really invest. And they had a lot of R&D saying, basically getting themselves ready for if this does happen, I want to know, I want to be part of it. It did take First Element, which was a startup that was also backed largely by Toyota, partly because of some frustrations around this issue, to kind of come in and try and really make this into a cookie cutter kind of business and just put stations very, very fast. And so I think that helped get out of that logjam. But yes, sourcing hydrogen, it's really making hydrogen, and where are you going to make it and how far away are you going to bring it in from is definitely an issue. But If you think about what we've done with petroleum, people are quite inventive on how far away you can bring it in from, if the economics are there.
Very true. Does anyone else have any questions for Remy? Oh, go ahead, Susanna. Oh, I thought she did.
Alicia, my screen is frozen, so I don't know if people are talking. I can't hear anyone talking.
Okay, no, I was going to say, I just reached out. Yeah, no, I thought Susanna had another question. Did you, Susanna?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Go right. Now we can hear you.
I can hear you. Yes. Yeah.
Darn. I was blabbing to myself. So my question for you, Remy, because I don't know you, are you here in the South Florida area working on trying to get hydrogen started here in our community?
Good question. And my apologies for not having told you more about my current involvement. The short answer is no. I currently have another role with an impact-related software company, but I remain always interested in electric vehicles and low carbon infrastructure. And when I arrived here, was reaching out through people like Alicia to find out what was happening. So I'm not going to say never, but right now I'm involved in other pursuits. I'd be obviously very excited if something did start to happen to be able to lend any kind of experiences from elsewhere to help drive or help support that process. But currently not involved with any companies, and aside from this role on the nonprofit in California, I don't have sort of any specific interest in this field. Although I am looking around where I live and seeing the lack of charging infrastructure in the condominiums, and hoping that they'll have more of it in place by the time I have to replace my current car. So.
I'll be working on that this year as well. Definitely, as a coordinator, I've actually been reaching out to a few HOAs just to kind of open up the conversation, because there are a lot of just condominiums, apartment complexes, duplexes, just a lot of those type of dwellings here in South Florida. And yeah, you don't have the opportunity to go ahead and just, put a charger in your home. So, but that is one of the areas that I am reaching out and working on this year, Remy. So
yeah, and Suzanne, to your point, if anyone has an interest or wants to talk about it, I'm always happy to talk and provide any contacts or anything useful if I can. So Alicia has my contact information, and just happy to help if I can.
I have another question. I just don't know if we have time.
No, go right ahead, Susanna. Yeah, it's 1:53. We still have about 7 minutes. So.
Okay. So as you mentioned, we're kind of slowly just starting to work on electric vehicles here in our South Florida community. And many of us do not have like formal strategies in place or plans in place. So my question is to you is, I mean, I know you gave us some tips while you were going through your presentation, but in terms of kind of planning, or what can my question is, what can we do as we're doing the planning for the electric vehicles? How can we incorporate hydrogen into that? Not necessarily that we're going to install it right away, but I guess. Right. For example, when you're doing solar, you can do solar ready, or when you're doing, you can make your parking spaces electric ready. So I'm just trying to think of how, because I think we would want to explore other fuel sources. So what can we be thinking of now to incorporate hydrogen into our planning?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I mean, what jumps to mind is that the hardest, the slowest part of the learning curve in California, from what I observed, was really getting the counties and the cities code ready, so that when the demand did come, they actually had some guidelines and uniformity around those. and so it didn't have to be, forgive me, I don't know the details of the processes, but I know that they wanted a sort of a standard process. If we're going to build like 30 stations, we don't want to be doing 30 different reviews and processes. So insofar as there's any major reviews of, I guess, coding and permitting processes that happens, either driven by you or that you know of among the cities, that would be the time to kind of, put it on the agenda even as a placeholder and see, and I'd be happy to find somebody who could kind of guide you on what the top ones. I wasn't really involved in that side of it as much, so I couldn't tell you, these are the top 5 things. But I definitely know that there's issues around, that are different than a gasoline station. The issues, though, I would say are more similar to a gasoline station than they are to your average charger. So it's more if you're looking at those kind of infrastructure policies, I would say that that's where they came to bear mostly. And then if you can, where possible, if you are putting in place incentives, just include it. We have a rebate program for EV purchase, in parentheses, battery or fuel cell, right? You can just kind of open it up so that when it does happen, you don't have to go back and rewrite all that stuff. So electric vehicle thought more broadly, I think, is a beginning point. And then more targeted, I would say, like if you're seeing an opportunity, and for example, I don't know if Jacksonville or Miami ports or any of these sort of big concentrated hubs of commercial activity and cargo activity, if any of them are starting to think about it, that I would say is a natural starting point for a hydrogen conversation for sure, because you probably will have Class 8 trucks wanting to show up here sometime soon, and not very far in the future, right? And they're going to want somewhere to fill. To be able to turn around and go back to California or wherever they came from. So those are some real things that will be happening soon. So if you can piggyback that requirement on in an area where there's a natural market, I think that would be something to put probably quite high on the list. Okay. But again, I'm happy to talk offline if you have other ideas or want to explore who would be a better guide than me on that one.
Well, I was going to say we're just about at 2 o'clock, Remy. I just wanted to say thank you for presenting and thank you for answering the questions, and we really appreciate having you. And I just wanted to say thank you for all the stakeholders that were able to attend. And if you guys do have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to me and I can provide Remy's contact information for whatever you guys need. So thank you again, Remy, and thank you everyone for joining.